Okay, so before we get rolling, I just wanted to congratulate y'all on a great job on that exam. Looks like we're doing a fair bit better. The median on the exam was an 85. That said, our range was from a 19% to 103%. So if you're still having trouble, I don't want you to get left behind. So let's find a way to work on that if you're one of those people in that boat. So set up something to meet with me during office hours. If you can't make office hours, we'll find some other time. I recommend asking the SI leaders about tips, the TAs in the anatomy lab about tips on how to study for this. We have tutoring available. We've got a lot of different ways you can go about this and try and get back up to speed. Okay, that said, we are starting a new-ish topic. We're continuing on with our nervous system, but now we're going to be thinking about this from a structural level. So what we're going to begin talking about today, something called the autonomic nervous system. Okay. We're going to see that the nervous system as a whole has a bunch of branches. So we talked before about central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Right, so your brain and spinal cord versus nerves everywhere else, your peripheral nervous system. Now we're going to be focusing primarily on a bunch of differences in the types of nerves you see in the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about the different neurotransmitters they use, the different chemicals they use, the differences in what muscles and glands they signal to and what those effects are, and kind of build off of that. Okay. So I really like this picture, and I highly recommend coming up with a simplified version for yourself to draw and redraw, because whenever people visit me in office hours during this unit, that's what I find myself drawing. So let's take a look. Okay. So we know we've got central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. That's this purple part up here. We've got our peripheral nervous system. So these are basically any signals we're sending into the central nervous system or out from the central nervous system. And down at the bottom, we've got our accessory kind of pieces of the body. So stuff that does stuff that's not exactly a nerve. Okay. So one thing we want to know is that we have a division between what's coming into the central nervous system and what's coming out of the central nervous system. Okay, so into the central nervous system, we have our sensory fibers, which are referred to as afferent fibers. So this is the afferent division of our nervous system. So that's anything coming from a receptor, whether it's on an organ, whether it's in your skin, anywhere, anything coming as a signal from the body into your spinal cord, into your brain, telling you something about the world. That's an afferent fiber. That's a sensory fiber. Okay. So we talked about those before when we talked about homeostasis and that kind of cycle, right? We needed to sense a change to a regulated variable in order to ultimately get the integrated center and then send out our response to change it back to our little negative feedback tail. What we're going to be thinking about a lot in this unit are our efferent fibers. Okay, so efferent, think about things that have an effect. Right? So efferent, sometimes referred to as motor fibers, anything going out into the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so all of this stuff here is part of our efferent division of our nervous system. And we're going to see pretty immediately when we look at those efferent fibers, we're going to have a split. Right, so some efferent fibers go to muscles, skeletal muscles, like your biceps or your quads, your trapezius, whatever you've been looking at in lab, right? So named muscles are usually skeletal muscle, so stuff attached to your skeleton. Okay, so those efferent fibers going to those places would be part of your somatic nervous system. Somatic, so we saw soma before when we looked at the parts of a neuron. Soma basically means like body. So the somatic nervous system is just the stuff going out to the skeletal muscle out in your body. on the other side, we have the topic of today's session. So we have our motor division, this efferent division, leading us into the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is going to be going places you don't really think about. So it's going to go to smooth muscle, which you have like in the lining of your gut and the lining of your blood vessels. It's going to go to cardiac muscle in your heart. It's going to go to the glands. This is not stuff that you're controlling consciously or voluntarily. So when you think autonomic, you almost think automatic, right? So stuff that's happening under the radar without you having to think about it involuntarily. Okay. So that's still part of our quote unquote motor division because it's still going out from the central nervous system through the peripheral nervous system. But it's not going to be going to named muscles. It's going to be going to these other places. So those are effector organs that we'll refer to for our autonomic nervous system. We're going to be going to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And you'll notice within our autonomic nervous system, we have one more split. Okay. So we know this is stuff that we're not doing voluntarily. We're not thinking about it. It's kind of an automatic process going to organ systems that we don't think of as being really under our conscious control. Now we're going to have a division between the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division here, both within this autonomic nervous system. So when I labeled this lecture ANS on the YouTube, autonomic nervous system, that's what that was, just abbreviating. So our sympathetic division and our parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system are both going to be going to the same place, right? So they're going to those same smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, but they're going to have different effects. So when we think about sympathetic versus parasympathetic, sympathetic, you want to kind of associate with a stress response. Sympathetic is going to be like our fight or flight kind of reaction. Parasympathetic, it's kind of like rhyming terms. So like that parasympathetic, they're going to be the like rest and digest part of your nervous system. So the parasympathetics in general are going to slow stuff down, ease stuff up, and basically control a lot of what we're going to talk about when we think about digestion. Okay. Cool. All right. So you can look at that map, but if we're thinking about what type of nerve fiber would take us from your nose with our smell receptors, our olfactory receptors, bring that information back to the brain, what kind of nerve is that going to be? Another second and we'll take a look. Cool. Yeah. So your olfactory nerve, right? So when you looked at the cranial nerves, you were looking at parts of the peripheral nervous system, right? Coming in and out of the brain, not solely located within the brain itself. So that olfactory nerve, that first cranial nerve that you were looking at, that would be a sensory nerve. So those are those afferent fibers, afferent coming in, right? Versus efferent would be going out, right? So coming into the central nervous system is afferent, going out is efferent. All those other answer choices. Okay, so both your sympathetic fibers and parasympathetic fibers are part of this efferent part of the nervous system. And so are your somatic fibers. So those would be sending signals to skeletal muscle. So all of this stuff would be nested within those efferent fibers because all of that is stuff coming out. So signals going out. So when we think about the autonomic nervous system, with its parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions in it, we think about this concept of dual innervation. Basically, thinking about the fact that any of the effector organs that we're going to think about, our final unit in this course is going to be the heart, and it's a great example for all this stuff. So I'm going to draw a heart. Okay, cool. So your heart, that cardiac muscle is one of our effector organs. Okay. So both our parasympathetic nerves and our sympathetic nerves are going to have fibers that go there. Right? So you'd have commands from your parasympathetic nervous system. But you're also going to have nerves coming from your sympathetic parts of the nervous system come into that same place. Okay. So that's this dual innervation idea. And so we're going to think of the action of the sympathetic and parasympathetic portions of the autonomic nervous system. It's kind of like a dimmer switch, right? So we're going to be going from, is your parasympathetic nervous system stronger? Is it on more towards one side? Or are we shifted towards that sympathetic division, more sympathetic action, stronger sympathetic signaling coming in? But for most of our effector organs, most of the places we're going, we do have both parts working together. So this is working kind of automatically, kind of in secretly. In general, parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest stuff. Sympathetic nervous system is our stress response, so our fight or flight. We're going to see that there are lots and lots of processes that involve one or both of these parts of the nervous system. We're going to mention the parasympathetics and the sympathetics over and over again as we talk through all our other organ systems, which is why we're fronting them right here and making sure we kind of understand them. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system on the whole, as it acts on these effector organs, using the parasympathetics and the sympathetics, is really regulating homeostasis. When we say that the integrator sends out signals to the rest of the body, to the organs, to maintain homeostasis, this is that pathway, basically. And here we're looking at a map of our systems. Okay. So we're going to see that we have nerves for the sympathetic parts of the nervous system versus the parasympathetic parts of the nervous system coming from different places. So one of the things that we're going to notice is different about these two parts is where they're originating. So here we can see our sympathetic nerves are all in green on this image. So these green nerves, if you track them back to the central nervous system, they're all coming out of this thoracolumbar region. So your thoracic vertebrae, and then the first two lumbar vertebrae, where you'd have those spinal nerves coming out and giving us some sympathetic innervation. Our parasympathetic nerves, you've already seen some of them, and our parasympathetic nerves are never going to come from the thorax. They're always going to come either off the brainstem. So this is going to be the cranial part. So some of those cranial nerves that you saw coming off the brain do carry parasympathetic innervation. And we'll also have a couple of contributions down here coming out of the sacrum. So from the sacral part, doing some of our organ systems in the lower half of the body, but nothing coming here from the middle, which means that some of our cranial nerves are going to have to reach really far. Specifically, the vagus nerve is going to actually end up giving parasympathetic innervation all the way down to your large intestines partially, right? So going through small intestine, large intestine, and it's not until there that you have these sacral parts picking up. So that's why vagus nerve was named the wanderer, because it goes everywhere. Okay, cool. So if we're looking at that vagus nerve, which of these statements are going to be true? So what is it part of? Okay, take another couple seconds. Take a look. Okay, cool. All right, so all three of these choices at the top are true. So let's think about that. All right, so we had afferent nerves coming in from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. That's not true, at least in the information I've given you so far about the vagus nerve. But we are in the peripheral nervous system, right? So coming out of the central nervous system, so coming out of the brain, going out, right, is our effector or motor part. Effector division of the peripheral nervous system, right? So we went out into the periphery of the body. We didn't just stay in the brain and spinal cord. So that's why this counts as true, part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Then we had that split between somatic and autonomic. So somatic nerves would all go to name skeletal muscles. Didn't name any skeletal muscles here in that very brief description of the vagus nerve. So not part of the somatic nervous system, which means that we are part of the autonomic nervous system, because that's on our other side. Okay. So we're part of the autonomic nervous system, right? And then if we're an autonomic nerve, we're going to split out whether we're part of the parasympathetics, so that resting and digesting, or our sympathetics, which is the fight or flight. Parasympathetic. Sorry, say words in my head when I spell them. Okay. Versus sympathetic. Okay. And our vagus nerve coming off the brainstem is going to be part of that rest and digest portion, going to be part of that parasympathetic division. Okay. And we can tell that in part because of where it comes from, coming off the brainstem, rather than coming from that thoracolumbar region, the thorax and the first two lumbar vertebrae. Okay. So that's part of how we know that this must be part of the parasympathetic division, even without thinking about what its specific actions are. Okay, cool. All right, so when we say we have dual innervation to the organs from the autonomic nervous system, we're not saying every nerve carries both sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're saying the location that we're going to receive both. Okay. So when we're thinking about how our nerves are getting there, right? So in general, we're going to start out in the central nervous system, okay? In the central nervous system, you would have the cell body of your first neuron, right? So there's the soma and dendrites of this preganglionic neuron, right? And here's its axon out to here. Okay. So this is a slightly new word. So preganglionic, you can think of that as being pretty similar to presynaptic, right? So pre before. This time what we're before is a ganglion. A ganglion is just somewhere there are cell bodies, right? So all we've changed here with this word preganglionic versus presynaptic is that we're specifying that instead of being before a synapse, any synapse, we're specifying that we are before a ganglion, which is somewhere where we'll specifically have the cell body of our next neuron, our postganglionic neuron. And then we can see its axon and its axon terminals over here. Okay. So preganglionic neuron is our first one. Then we'll hit the cell body of our postganglionic neuron. So that's our next neuron in line. So we can see that we have gone from the central nervous system, extended into the peripheral nervous system with that preganglionic neuron. And now we're fully in the peripheral nervous system with that second neuron in the chain. Okay. So ultimately, that postganglionic neuron is going to very specific effector organs if we're part of the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to cardiac muscle, the heart. We're going to smooth muscle, which is like blood vessels and your gut. We'll go to gland, and we'll talk about the many glands that we are going to be involving when we talk about the endocrine system. And some of them even go a little bit to fat, so adipose tissue as well. It's on the list, but we won't really think much about that in this course. Okay. So this is a general map overall of any generic kind of autonomic nerve, kind of pathway, whether it's part of the sympathetic or part of the parasympathetic. We'll talk about detailed pathways within each of those divisions, but overall, this is what it looks like. Questions to this point? Go on that. Okay. So now we're thinking about the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system specifically. Focusing just on those green nerves, which is why I cropped this image to the side. Okay. So we can see if we are looking at those sympathetic nerves, they're starting in that thoracolumbar region. Right, so what we're saying there is that for our preganglionic neuron, so that first one in our sequence, it's going to have its cell body inside the spinal cord here, right? So specifically, the place that you would find that soma, that cell body for a preganglionic neuron in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, that's a mouthful, okay? But you can see it on the picture, right? So here, you'd find it in a region called the lateral horn of the spinal cord, in a cell column called the interomediolateral cell column. I think we have a picture of that on the next slide too. Okay. So for its general anatomy, if we're looking at the sympathetic nervous system, we're going to see that we have a couple of routes we can take to our effector organs. So here we can see effector organs, right? We've got an example of some glands. So here we have sympathetic nerves going to your eye, so to some lacrimal glands, some salivary glands. We've got some organs here. We've got cardiac muscle here. We've got a bunch of gut stuff, more glands. gut tube contains smooth muscle, blood vessels in your lungs contain smooth muscle, right? That kind of thing. Those are effector organs. Okay. So we got a couple ways to get there. We're going to start with our preganglionic neuron. The most typical way that we're going to have a sympathetic nerve get out to an effector organ is to start, let's do this one. Okay, I'm going to pick this one on T3. So we're going to have a short preganglionic neuron that goes into a structure called the sympathetic chain. So we're not into the thorax in lab, so you won't see the sympathetic chain until next semester, but this is a physical structure that you can see running parallel to the spinal column, where we have a bunch of ganglia linked together, right? So we have this preganglionic neuron to the sympathetic chain. The sympathetic chain is a bunch of ganglia strung together. Ganglia contain cell bodies. Particularly, what we have here is our cell body of our postganglionic neuron. Okay. So our postganglionic neuron starts here in the sympathetic chain, and then it takes kind of a long route to whatever organ it's going to. So we can see here that the longer pathway is for that postganglionic neuron out to its organ. Okay. So that's the most typical pathway that we'll see for the sympathetic nervous system. But you'll see that we do have two alternative routes for specific parts of the body, which we'll get to in a second. Okay. So we got some exceptions. So our main way we've shown here. Okay, so here we can see that lateral horn in the interomediolateral cell column for origin of our preganglionic neuron. You can see it's kind of short, going to the sympathetic chain, which is where it's synapsing with its postganglionic neuron, going out to the organ. So that would be the longer part. But we do have two other ways we can get to effector organ if we're a sympathetic nerve. So one thing that happens to be true, and jump to the bottom of this image here. So some places in the body, we have ganglia that aren't linked together in this sympathetic chain. So one easy modification here, that some places we're going to have a sympathetic neuron, preganglionic neuron, that goes out to a collateral ganglion. So collateral, just think like extra, right? So collateral ganglion somewhere else. And then we'd have a relatively shorter path to our effector organ with our postganglionic neuron. But the extra cool place, right? So we have option one, normal option is through the sympathetic chain. Here we have a kind of modification of that for option two. Option three is really specific to your adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are going to be really linked together with our sympathetic nervous system. Conceptually, we're going to think about the adrenal gland and like adrenaline later on. Right? But our adrenal gland here, we can see the connection with the sympathetic nervous system immediately. Okay. So here's our preganglionic neuron, starting out as normal in that thoracolumbar region, in the lateral horn. Okay, going out. But this preganglionic neuron goes all the way into the center of your adrenal gland. So we're going to the adrenal medulla, so think like center, because we're also going to have an adrenal cortex later on. So all the way to the inside. Okay. And there, just inside that adrenal gland, we're going to have a modified postganglionic cell called a chromaffin cell. So that's that little dot there is your chromaffin cell. Okay. So when we do that, we have a couple options for our types of molecules that we're going to release. So like sometimes we'll think of them as neurotransmitters, sometimes we'll sort of think of them as hormones. Technically, chemistry, they're catecholamines. Okay. So what we're going to be releasing here is we're going to be releasing 80% epinephrine. Okay, so 80% epinephrine from the inside. Okay. 20% is going to be something called norepinephrine. Okay. And using other terminology, these are equivalent to adrenaline and noradrenaline. Those are just alternate terms, but we're using epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's kind of like a regional difference. And we got a little dopamine being released here too. So we got 3 ways to get to effector organs if we're in a sympathetic pathway. First one, preganglionic neuron through our sympathetic chain, postganglionic neuron from the sympathetic chain to the effector organ. Second route, we can have a preganglionic neuron to a collateral ganglion and a slightly shorter postganglionic neuron to our effector organ. Our third way is specific to the adrenal medulla, in which case we go all the way into the adrenal gland and synapse on a primitive cell. So here's that just zoomed in again. So here's that first route. All right, so the normal way involves ganglia and connections in the sympathetic chain. We've got another option involving a collateral ganglion, which just isn't connected to the sympathetic chain, but it's the same idea. And our third way, which is specific to the inside of the adrenal gland. If we are looking at those preganglionic nerves, let's zoom in on what's going on between the sympathetic chain and that preganglionic neuron in our typical pathway for a sympathetic nerve. Okay. So we're starting out in our lateral horn. It's our preganglionic neuron. Okay. So we're going to see that that preganglionic neuron exits a specific part of our spinal cord. So specifically, it's going to come out the ventral route. So anytime you see the word ventral, think stomach. Ventral is the opposite of dorsal. If you see dorsal, think like a dorsal fin on a shark. Okay. So ventral route, so we're coming out the front of our spinal cord. And we're merging together with stuff coming from the dorsal root. So here we can see that we've formed a nerve that would have mixed composition. So there will be other types of fibers within most of the nerves that you see out in your body. We do have mixing together of fibers. Okay. So we can see that we're coming into the spinal nerve. Okay, so we're on a spinal nerve. Say this is the T3 spinal nerve, whatever, pick a number. Okay. We can then see that we're going to jump from the spinal nerve into our sympathetic chain. So you can see this loop here. Okay. So we're coming into the sympathetic chain on something called the white ramus. Okay. So here we can see that's the way we're getting onto the sympathetic chain. Here we are synapsing with our postganglionic neuron in the darker blue. That postganglionic neuron starting here. And then it's jumping back onto the spinal nerve on something called the gray ramus. So ramus, anytime you see it, that means like branch or arm. Okay. So we came in on the white arm, we're leaving on the gray arm. The difference is myelin, right? Because we know myelin gives like white color to stuff. Okay. So when we're jumping back on, we're going on the gray ramus. We're back on the spinal nerve, back mixed in with potentially other types of fibers coming here from the dorsal root. And then we're going out to our effector organ. Okay. So that communication and synapsing ultimately is taking place here in that sympathetic chain in the ganglia where we have this synapse between the axon terminal of our preganglionic neuron and the cell body of our postganglionic neuron. Okay. So for the postganglionic neuron, we're leaving the ganglion, leaving the sympathetic chain on this gray ramus, okay? And then we're re-entering our spinal nerve. Then we're going out to an effector organ, like the heart, like smooth muscle, like glands, down our postganglionic neuron, which is in the spinal nerve for a while. Okay. For the collateral ganglia, so our second route that sympathetic nerves can take, it would work the same. It's just the ganglion would be somewhere else in the body, just wouldn't be directly in that sympathetic chain. So those three actions refer our sympathetic nerve. Now we're thinking about our parasympathetic nerves. So the parasympathetic, that rest and digest portion. And we know an example of a neuron that carries some parasympathetic innervation is the vagus nerve. We saw it coming off the brainstem, which means we can check off already part of our definition for parasympathetic nerves, right? Coming from the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord. So we think of them as craniosacral in origin. Cool. Vagus nerve does that. For the anatomy of this nerve, right, you're going to have a long route from wherever you started, right? So our preganglionic neuron, you can see here, in this example, started in the brainstem. So we can think of it as the vagus nerve, right, as our example. So we started there, go into the peripheral nervous system, long way, right? You're the vagus nerve, you might be going as low as the intestines, right? And we've seen where it starts in the brainstem. That's a long route for that preganglionic fiber, okay? And then on the effector organ, we'll have a ganglion, but it's going to be really short. So this postganglionic neuron is going to be short, it's going to be next to the effector organ, pretty close. So here we can see that shorter postganglionic neuron here after our ganglion, wherever we had a cell body. So one difference that we will often see between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic for counting differences, which we should be. Right? So we've got origin of our nerves, right? Whether we're in the thoracolumbar region or craniosacral. Now we know that in our typical route for our arrangement of neurons in a row, in our normal sympathetic route, we had a short preganglionic neuron to the sympathetic chain, and then a longer postganglionic neuron out to some organ. Versus in our parasympathetic nervous system, we've got this long preganglionic neuron out to almost wherever we're going, and then just a short little postganglionic fiber to the organ itself. So examples of other parasympathetic nerves that you have already seen, in addition to the vagus nerve, not all of your cranial nerves carry parasympathetics, but several do. So specifically, your oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, carries some parasympathetic innervation. Cranial nerve 7, your facial nerve, carries some parasympathetic innervation. And cranial nerve 9, your glossopharyngeal nerve, also carries parasympathetic innervation. So for cranial nerves that carry parasympathetic innervation, what we're saying, we're dividing this on effector organs, right? So those cranial nerves are going to go to some glands, they're going to go to some smooth muscle. That's why they're parasympathetic. Your other cranial nerves that aren't on this list are cranial nerves that are either fully sensory, so afferent fibers carrying information to your brain, right? So that's all your special senses, right? So your optic nerve is going to be afferent, carrying vision in, olfactory is carrying smell in, same thing for vestibulocochlear. Some other nerves, like your trigeminal nerve, aren't on this list because they do control named muscles. So your trigeminal nerve, for example, the sensation in the face, that would be an afferent part. And then named chewing muscles, like a little muscle attached to bone. So its motor part would actually be. That's why it's not a full, complete list of your cranial nerves here. So, but these ones are important, carry parasympathetic innervation. All of them but the vagus nerve just kind of stay in your face. So we're not going to really be thinking about them. So you can see here, those cranial nerves mostly go into glands. So we've got lacrimal glands, we've got salivary glands here, right? But it's your vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, that goes all throughout your body practically. So that's the important one to really think about for the future. For your sacral spinal nerves that are part of the parasympathetics, they're going to be coming from the sacral region. So they would do smooth muscle and glands in the genitalia, in the bladder, and in the lower parts of your GI tract. There will be separate somatic nerves coming from this region as well, which we won't talk about, but they exist. Find ourselves, what we've really been talking about today thus far, the anatomical arrangement of our nerves and the conceptual basis for understanding the branches of our nervous system. One of the ways we're thinking about these different types of nerves are how do they get to their effector organs that ultimately are going to actually do something. Okay, so let's talk about that. So our goal is to get to an organ, an effector organ, and our example one can be a heart. Okay, so to get there, if you are a sympathetic nerve, you're going to be starting in the spinal cord. So here's my spinal cord. And we know that we're going to involve the sympathetic chain. So that part we got right. Okay. So that's like a bunch of beads, essentially, parallel. Okay. But we only have like two nerves that we're interested in, right? So we have a preganglionic and postganglionic fiber, right? So it is really just kind of like a chain of two nerves. So we have our preganglionic that goes into the sympathetic chain. And then we have our postganglionic that goes out. All right, so that's why the second answer choice is actually the correct one. Okay. So if you imagine what the first answer is explaining, which is not correct, right? That would be saying that you have one nerve going to the sympathetic chain, then you have a second nerve going somewhere here, and then you have a third one going to the organ, and we're just thinking about a chain of two. So that's not the case. We only go through another ganglion near the effector organ if we're a parasympathetic nerve, in which case we'd be coming like from the brain stem. This is my brain, right? So we'd have a preganglionic neuron coming off the brain stem, going all the way to a ganglion over here, and then a little short one, right? But that's a different route. And we still have this whole chain of 1, 2, preganglionic, postganglionic. So you don't have to add extra steps. Don't overthink it. Don't make it too complicated. The next topic, we're just going to intro, but we'll talk about this mostly on Friday. So the next difference we're going to be thinking about when we think about our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system we're going to be thinking about our different neurotransmitters, and we're going to be thinking about how the receptors for all those neurotransmitters work. So critically, we're going to be thinking a lot about acetylcholine. Right, so acetylcholine is going to be labeled ACH. We're going to be thinking a lot about receptors for norepinephrine and epinephrine, right? But hopefully, we already realized that these are going to be linked up to different parts of the nervous system. The picture is going to be a little complicated, but when we talk about the norepinephrine pathway, epinephrine and all those receptors, we're going to be really dealing with the sympathetic nervous system. Acetylcholine we'll see in multiple places, but ultimately we'll see it a lot more when we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system. And I'll break that down on Friday. That's our preview. Sound good? Final question? Okay, I'll stick around. That's what we're doing. I do recommend taking a look at some of this neurotransmitter stuff, receptor stuff ahead of time, because specifically our adrenergic receptors, there are lots of them. And if it's the first time you see them when I talk about them, your brain will probably glaze over. Take a look at them ahead of time.